Well, hey there, welcome back. So, in this series, we're looking at the Corinthian church and we're asking the question, are we Corinth? And what I've been trying to do is to demonstrate that so much of what the Corinthians are doing is still so true in the modern church. Just the general attitudes that the Corinthians had, that hasn't changed. Human behavior or human attitudes haven't changed. Sin hasn't changed. And the behavior itself, how that manifests itself, might change in certain circumstances, but what's behind that is always the same. And so we've seen a variety of examples of how that's the case, and just sort of reflecting hopefully on, who we are today, how much have we actually changed, and hopefully, I guess, to see the Corinthian letters in a different light, to understand them as, well, probably speaking directly to us as much as they did to the Corinthians. So hopefully that's been helpful. But what we started last week was a new sort of a topic within a topic. And I'm looking at a situation where Paul actually got rejected by his church. The Corinthian church is ultimately kicked him out of his own church. They rejected him as their pastor and actually went off and replaced him with these new pastors, with these new, what they called super apostles. And so what I began to do was to look at the circumstances behind that. And really, this particular incident is the reason why we have 2 Corinthians. We have a 2 Corinthians because 1 Corinthians didn't work. In fact, it seems that the letter of 1 Corinthians actually made the situation worse. And so what we're looking at in 2 Corinthians is the flow on from that. It's actually sort of comes after a whole big falling out that's taken place in the church. And so it's sort of something of a last-ditch effort on Paul's part to try to reconcile what has been a really difficult situation between him and the church. So just by way of a quick recap, what Paul is in the ancient world is an orator. He's a professional speaker. If you were to ask somebody in the ancient world, if you were to point to Paul and say, what type of person is that? They would say he's a philosopher, he's an orator. He's not a religious person, he's not a priest. There's nothing about him that resembles what we would assume from a priest. He's a professional speaker. That's what he does. Now, you might see him working in the shop, and certainly he would have been doing that in certain occasions, but his primary vocation is preaching. And so that's what he was. And so with that profession comes a certain expectation. There were characteristics or there were things that were expected of an orator that made them better than the rest. And primary amongst those was their eloquence. They needed to be a good speaker. They needed to be thoroughly trained. The reason what makes an orator good is that they're educated. And so you get a particular kind of education in oratory. And so because you're educated to begin with is a sign of your wealth. Only very wealthy elite families can educate their children, and they educate them so that they can be successful, and specifically within public life, within political life. So the primary quality or the primary skill you need for public life is the ability to speak well. Now, that means that if you are educated, you can speak. You've been trained to be an orator. Now, of course, in like all things, there are some that are better than others. There are some that are just naturally gifted to speak, and others not so much. And so education can certainly help everybody to speak better, but some will just be naturally better than others. And so what you're looking for in your orator is the quality of their speech. They speak very well. They're very eloquent. And the education around oratory is very holistic. It's not just about learning how to construct a good argument and how to use your voice to speak well. That is absolutely part of it. And voice exercises were paramount. In fact, one of the practices or one of the skills that you used to use, or one of the training exercises that an orator used to do, would be to go to the beach, fill their mouth with rocks, and then speak as loudly as they could over the sound of the waves, and would need to be heard from a distance clearly. Not just you can speak loudly, but you can speak clearly even when you've got a mouth full of rocks. So, I mean, these were sort of the crazy exercises that used to be practiced in order just to be eloquent, in order just to be able to speak very well. So how to speak well and to be able to use your voice well was an essential quality. But there was much more to it than just that. It's the ability to formulate an argument, the ability to construct an argument over a period of a long hour, 2 hour long argument that is eloquent, that is succinct, that is articulate, and to be able to do that and then to be able to memorize it. It's not just about reading off a speech. You need to be able to memorize a 1 or a 2 hour speech and to be able to give that off the cuff, or to be able to give that without any notes, so that you could devote certainly your hands, but your overall body into the gestures required for public speaking. And so you would be learning dance, you would be learning drama, you would be learning the skills of acting, the ability to change the tone of your voice, the ability to be able to use certain tones for certain arguments, and so, learning how to deliver a joke or learning how to bring people to tears. Well, that's the skill of an actor. And so you're learning drama, you're learning how to perform in the theatre, but also learning gymnastics so that you can be eloquent and fluid in your motions. For every point, there needed to be a certain gesture that went along with that, and that needed to be fluid. It needed to be effortless. And so in the same way that you'll see a gymnast performing some great, incredible feat and then landing and then they've got a big smile on their face like it was effortless, that's how an orator needed to be. And then, of course, you need to look good. You need to build your body. You need to actually go to the gym and look good in a toga. And so all of this is a holistic training that goes along with being an orator. It's so much more than just the ability to speak clearly. It's the ability to enamor an audience, that they would be captivated by every aspect. Everything about you has been perfected and honed to a point where a lifetime of effort has gone into a speech, and yet you do it so easily that it's as though you were just born that way. That's what a good orator can do. And so because you've been through that much training, what that tells everybody is that you're a better person. You're educated, and so therefore you've got this holistic training that just makes you spiritually, mentally, intellectually, physically, you are better than everybody else. You are a superior human being. And again, that is reflected in your eloquence, in your ability to speak. So that's what an orator should be. And the best ones of those are the most refined. They're the ones who can have all of those skills, but have it at a greater extent. That is not just a better speaker, that is a better person. That's a better human being through and through. Paul wasn't any of those things. When Paul came to Corinth, he deliberately dumbed down his ability to speak, specifically so that he wouldn't be mistaken for one of these great orators. It's not that Paul couldn't speak, he clearly could, but when it came to the Corinthian church, he dialed it right back because he didn't want them to be enamored by him. He wanted to draw the attention to Jesus Christ. Now, add to that, the city of Corinth hosted the Isthmian Games. This was a primary games amongst the 4 Panhellenic games, and one of the chief activities of that was oratory. Oratory literally was a part of the Olympic Games. And as strange as that sounds, but then let's not forget we have breakdancing at the most recent Olympics, so we haven't really got much to cast aspersions at those guys. Anyway, they were used to the best. Every 2 years, the best of the best orators would come to Corinth. And so they were used to that. But then beyond that, because Corinth was such a wealthy, sort of transient sort of city, it was a city that had lots of people coming in and out all the time, and it was just a generally prosperous city. They had the best of the best coming all the time anyway. So they were used to They were a city that was just used to hosting the best orators. And so for Paul to come to a city like that, already there's a built-in expectation. Already the Corinthians, the native Corinthians, have been accustomed to the best. They don't do second-rate quality. And so for Paul, when he comes in, he dials it right back because, again, he doesn't want the distraction to be towards him. It needs to be about Jesus Christ. He needs the focus to be towards the Christ of whom he is preaching. So he does that, and he has some sort of minor success, clearly because there's a church that he leaves behind. Clearly people still listen to him, but he has to explain to them in the first letter to Corinthians that, guys, what you saw of me was me dumbing it down. That was intentional so that the attention wouldn't come to me, it would go to Jesus Christ. So he explains that in the first letter, and to not much avail, because as we see in 2 Corinthians, they're still holding this grudge that he wasn't a very good speaker, and now they've got these better speakers, and so why do we need Paul anymore? And so then the second characteristic, or the second thing that that a public speaker will do is that they'll travel around. Now, typically, a public speaker or an orator will be a teacher as well. And that's a very common trade that they would have. And so they would have students that they would train in oratory. And this goes all the way back to the Athenian democracy. So this is a pretty standard sort of thing. If you've got this skill, you've been to university, you're trained as a speaker, and you're very good, people want to learn from you. Parents want their kids to learn from you, so you can become a fairly successful teacher. Now, that comes with its own set of risks because there's no educational system in the HOL. The educational system is I'm a teacher, and if you want to learn my skills, follow me, I'll teach you, and then at the end of the year you pay me. It's not like you get a weekly income. At the end of the year, you've had these kids for the whole year, you give them back to the parents, and then the parents will pay you. So you literally get paid once a year. And at the same time, the parents might say, well, I'm not really happy with Johnny's progression. I don't feel like you've done a very good job with him, so I don't feel like you deserve to be paid. And so teachers could go a whole year and have parents turn around and just refuse to pay them. And so that wasn't uncommon. So it's a really risky business to get into. It's a lot of hard work, and it can literally end in no reward. So teaching isn't necessarily the ideal. It's not the best way necessarily to make a living. So another way that you could make an income is to go and become basically an employee in a wealthy household. So a wealthy patron or a wealthy person in a city will have lots of people that are dependent on him because that's how he demonstrates to everybody else how rich he is. He's a wealthy person, therefore he can support all these other people. In a world that doesn't have any sort of government benefits, you look for a wealthy person to become a patron. They will take care of some of your needs, and in return, you give them honor. In return, you sing their praises. You tell everybody how good they are. You become their client, and anytime they need your help, you're there. You have to be there. And what that might even look like is that you just become their posse. They're walking around, they're going around the city doing their public duties and their public business in politics or in giving a speech or whatever it is that they might be doing. The way that you reciprocate, they've looked after you, they've provided for you and your family, they've provided bread, whatever it is that you need. You can reciprocate back to them by following them around, literally just following them around like a big crowd, to the extent of being their bodyguard if it ever comes to that. But generally the idea is that if you're a wealthy patron, you want a crowd who's following you, a crowd of your dependents. And the bigger the crowd, the more generous you are, therefore the better you are. And so it's literally just about, how big my gang is an indication of how good I am. And so if you might be giving a speech that day, and so your group, your gang, your posse, they would be the ones in the crowd giving the loudest applause and giving the loudest shouts and making sure that everybody's getting into it. Or they would just generally follow you around and do whatever it is that you need. Just look good, whatever that might be. So amongst that retinue, amongst that sort of bunch of clients that you would have, one of the things that you really want to have is your own personal philosopher. Right? You don't want to you want somebody who is smart. You want somebody who's done all the education. I mean, we carry around phones with Wikipedia and Google. We can find anything we want. Imagine having before phones when you've got to do that with a person, right? Or, you may not have the time to read everything that there is and have all of this knowledge, but you've got somebody who's educated, somebody who's trained, who has got all of that knowledge, and they can be just your personal philosopher. I've got my own philosopher. It's a great thing to boast about. And so what you can become as an educated person, rather than being a teacher, you can become literally a literary client. You can become just a professional, educated person, and your job is whatever's required of you that day by your master. And to the extent that you would live with them, you would become part of the family. You're now working full-time for this person. Now, that's good in the sense that it gives you a regular income, and you don't have to worry about students and trying to get enough support from other people. You've got a means of support, but it also means you're owned by the person. They literally own you, right? You are obligated to them and to nobody else, and so you've just got to do their bidding. Now, what seems to have happened when Paul got to Corinth is that somebody had made him this offer, right? Somebody had said to him, look, we'll be your patron, and you can be our personal pastor. Whoever it was who made that offer, we don't know, but that offer seems to clearly have been made, and Paul refused it. He just couldn't do it naturally because he can't be owned by somebody. He's owned by Jesus Christ already. He can't be owned by somebody else, and he needs to be free to be able to preach to whomever he pleases, and that is, well, everybody. So he can't do that. It simply wasn't an option for him, and so instead he chose to do his leatherworking, which wasn't just the fact that he chose to work instead of taking this offer. It's the fact that he chose to work. A sophisticated orator, an educated person like that doesn't do manual labor. That's why you get educated, so that you don't have to do work. You get other people to do that for you. So a wealthy, educated, sophisticated person has people like those clients I just described to do all of that. And so you don't do that sort of work. You don't work with your hands. An educated person simply doesn't do that. The fact that Paul did was an offense. Right? The fact that Paul went and worked in a workshop was a mark against his name. And this was a sore point. In fact, a couple of points through Paul's letters, he talks about his working with his own hands amongst his sufferings, amongst the things that he doesn't want to do. It wasn't that Paul enjoyed working. He hated it because it took him away from preaching, but he had to do it because that's the way in which he was going to be supported in his ministry. But then when Apollos comes along, not only is he a great orator, he does seem to take this support. We talked about this last week. Apollos seems to have been exactly what these Corinthians were looking for all along. And so he becomes the new man. In some cases, you've got some of these Corinthians who were sitting under Paul's ministry, maybe saved under Paul's ministry, who've gone, you know what, we've got a better guy now. Apollos is more sophisticated. He takes support, and he seems to be better educated. He's got this level of wisdom that Paul doesn't have. You know, Paul just gave us milk all day. Every time all he ever preached about was Christ crucified, and yet Apollos, he gives us this deeper wisdom that we sophisticated Corinthians have been looking for. So Apollos is the man as far as they're concerned. He ticks all the boxes of what you would expect from an orator. And so naturally they gravitate towards him. And what we end up with is groups. We get, I follow Paul, I follow Apollos, because Apollos has now become their man. He's become their favorite preacher. But the other trigger for all of this is that when Paul was in Corinth, he refused the support from the Corinthians. He went and did his leatherworking. But then on top of that, when Timothy and Silas came from Macedonia, they brought some support from the Philippians that Paul did take. And it's a whole different story, but the Philippians had effectively entered into a missionary partnership with Paul. And so when they sent that offering with Paul, he very gladly accepted it. He took that offering and at the same time, having refused the Corinthians, he took the Philippian money. And in that sort of a culture, in that sort of environment, that's a big no-no. That's a huge offense. You know, their money's good enough for you, but not ours. That's a huge insult in this sort of culture. And so all of that has sort of compounded in some disgruntled people turning against Paul. And there's a real sort of, Paul has fallen out of favor with some of the Corinthians, let's put it that way. So anyway, all of that sort of has been festering for a couple of years, and then Paul sends out 1 Corinthians, and number one, gives an explanation for why he wasn't very eloquent. So 1 Corinthians 2, he talks about the fact that he was just not a good preacher, but that was on purpose. But then in Corinthians 16, he says, but now about the offering for Jerusalem. Again, we talked this last week, but there's a whole offering that Paul's been taking up, and so Paul's coming to collect on it. He says, I'm going to come over to you guys soon. I'm going to collect on this offering. I hope it's ready, and then, you know, we'll carry on. They've heard that and said, hang on a second, no, you didn't take our money the first time, but now you're going to take it for Jerusalem, quote unquote. Well, now we've got some suspicion being raised that maybe this money isn't for Jerusalem at all. In fact, it might actually be for Paul. And so word gets back to Paul that there's questions about Paul's integrity, specifically that Paul may be actually embezzling this money. So he realizes, all right, I've got to go and deal with this. So he goes over to Corinth. He's in Ephesus at the time. He goes over to Corinth and he confronts the church, you know, just to what's going on. Like, what I'm hearing all these accusations. Anyway, one particular person stands up and makes this direct accusation against Paul that he is embezzling money from them. He's got no witnesses, no proof of this. It's just his suspicion. But it's enough to make Paul realize, hey, man, look, this is not not good. This is a bad situation. And so Paul he's sort of caught off guard. He doesn't have an opportunity to make a really solid defense of himself. It's the last thing he would have expected to have happen is the church like drag him into a kangaroo court and then, make all these accusations. And so Paul sort of says to them at the time, look, I'll come back when we've got cooler heads and we'll deal with this properly. In the meantime, I need to get back to Ephesus and we'll have to come back and deal with this later. But one more dimension that's occurred throughout this is that some of the Corinthians have actually gone out and replaced Paul with what they call super apostles. These guys who've come in who are ultimately Paul's opponents, have been haunting his steps throughout his ministry. These guys have now rocked up to Corinth and have been embraced by some of these Corinthians who already don't really like Paul very much. And now they're hearing from these other so-called apostles who are just compounding their suspicions. And Paul's this and Paul's that. He's not really an apostle. And all of these other accusations that are being made. And so Paul's coming off terribly in the midst of all of this. And that on top of an accusation of embezzlement, Paul is just not in a good position here. His church has literally rejected him based on a false measure or understanding of what an apostle should look like, but then also compounded by his opponents who sort of seem to be presenting themselves as the type of apostles that these Corinthians have come to expect. And so what they want from Paul then is a defense. They want Paul to explain himself. And at the time, when he's in Corinth, he seems to be caught off guard to the point where he gets tongue-tied. He just doesn't know quite how to do it. I mean, imagine, as a pastor, you turn up to church on a Sunday and the church is sitting around in the cafe saying, Pastor, we need to have a chat, and then just throws out all these accusations against you, and you just think, what the heck is going on? How do we get to this? And you're not ready for it. You just don't quite know what on earth is going on, particularly when they're not true. I mean, these are false accusations that have been made against Paul. I mean, how do you defend against a lie? And so, in those circumstances, you're going to be caught off guard. This is what on earth is going on? And so naturally, you're not going to be able to give the most sophisticated defense. You're not going to be able to, articulately, debunk all of these accusations that have been made. And that seems to be what happened to Paul. He was caught off guard and wasn't able to make a decent defense of himself. But effectively, what these Corinthians are saying to Paul is, tell us why we should have you back. We've got these literal super apostles. And that's not a name that the Corinthians gave to those guys. They gave those names to themselves. They called themselves super apostles. He said, we've got super apostles here. You're barely an apostle, Paul, if you're even a Christian, because you probably embezzling money. Why should we take you back? What is it that's so good about you? And so what they're ultimately requesting, or what they're ultimately demanding that Paul give them, is his CV. We want you to tell us, we want you to boast to us of how good you are and how you are even better than a super apostle in order for us to bring you back. So tell us, what is it? What is so good about you that would make you superior to these guys? And so this is the demand they're making of Paul, and what Paul has to respond with is a letter. He decides, he gets back to Ephesus, having just been confronted by his church, and he goes back to Ephesus and decides, you know what, it's probably not the best that I do go back. It's just going to be another heated emotional argument. So the best thing instead would be to send a letter. And to send it with somebody else, not me. Somebody else can take this. They can become something of my lawyer. They can be an advocate for me. They've got no dog in the fight, right? They're not going to be emotional about it. They can just give a clear defense of my own position and who I am to these Corinthians, and say the things that I would want to say, but maybe wouldn't be able to do it as emotionless as what this other guy can. So Paul writes this letter and he sends it along with Titus. So Titus goes back to Corinth with this letter of tears, and which is ultimately Paul's defense. It's ultimately Paul's explanation to the Corinthians of his position and who he is. And so we're going to read a lot of this letter. Won't spend a lot of time in it, but we'll read basically 2 chapters of it and just sort of listen, just hear Paul's tone, hear Paul's defense of himself and the heart behind it. This is Paul being put into a position where he has to give a defense of his own ministry. Jesus Christ has called him to be an apostle, and yet these Corinthians are saying, no, prove it. We don't believe you. And so what they are expecting from Paul is for him to boast. Now, the thing about the ancient world, particularly in Australia, we don't really like boasting very much. We've got a real tall poppy syndrome sort of culture, and we just don't like arrogance. We don't like people that just want to talk about themselves all the time and boast about how great they are. It's different different story in the ancient world. Boasting is perfectly acceptable so long as it's true. You can boast about all the great things you've done, and you're expected to. That's how you make a name for yourself. You want to tell everybody how good you are. Even better, you want everybody else to tell everybody how good you are. But the point is, everybody knows how good you are. So boasting is fine as long as it's true. But when you start to boast about things that are not true, that's a problem. That's hubris. That's just lying. And we don't like that. We don't tolerate that sort of thing. But boasting itself, perfectly fine. They want Paul to boast. They want him to go through his CV and talk about all the incredible things that he's done and that he's achieved and what makes him such a great apostle. That's what they want to hear from Paul. Now, Paul, of course, can't do that. That's not in him to do that. He doesn't have that capacity anymore because now he's been crucified in Christ. All he can boast about is Jesus Christ. He's literally a servant, a slave of Christ. A slave can't boast. A slave is a slave. That's their position in life. Paul is that as far as Christ is concerned, and so he can't boast. There's nothing he can say that would be of any value anyway, because everything that he's achieved wasn't him, it was in Christ. But that's not what the Corinthians want to hear. They want to hear Paul boasting. And so Paul's sort of in this situation where he has to boast in order for them to take him back, but he can't boast because that would be completely counter to everything he is in Christ. What is he going to do? And so very sneakily, he comes up with sort of this third option where he seems to be boasting, but the things that he's boasting about are the very opposite of what the Corinthians are looking for. He boasts about all the things that would make him seem to be the worst type of person in their society, and certainly compared to the great orators who boast about all of their great achievements, Paul's boasting as an orator, but of all of the things that are the total antithesis to what it means to be superior in this world. And so he gives what scholars call the fool's speech. He's talking as a fool. And so what he's doing here is offering his CV, which is his genuine CV. These are the things that actually make him in Christ. And this is what the Corinthians want. They want him to prove to them that he's an apostle. But what they want to hear are the characteristics that they think an apostle should be. They're looking for the great, superior, wealthy, powerful, articulate, charismatic orator, thinking that that's what it should look like to be an apostle of Jesus Christ. And Paul's saying, look, I will tell you what makes me an apostle of Christ, but it's not the things you're looking for. Because what this whole situation comes down to is a false expectation. They see Paul, or they think an apostle should look like this, and in fact, it actually is supposed to look like something entirely different. And what Paul's trying to point out is that actually this is exactly what I am. Jesus Christ was crucified. That was how he brought about salvation. And so if we are going to embody and to emulate and to be exemplars of Jesus Christ, we too should have lives that are crucified. And so for Paul, he's saying, my life looks exactly like Jesus on the cross. And so who's the better representative of Jesus than the guy who is looking like the same, the guy who's basically been crucified himself? There's nothing to boast about that. And so what Paul is presenting is the truth. This is what makes him an apostle. It's just not what the Corinthians are looking for, and therein lies the problem. It's coming back to a false expectation. So again, a lot of scripture. Bear with me. But we'll pick it up in chapter 11, verse 1. It says, I hope you will put up with me in a little foolishness. Yes, please put up with me. I'm jealous for you with a godly jealousy. I promised you to one husband, to Christ, so that I might present you as a pure virgin to him. But I'm afraid that just as Eve was deceived by the serpent's cunning, your minds may somehow be led astray from your sincere and pure devotion to Christ. For even if someone comes to you and preaches a Jesus other than the Jesus we preached, or if you receive a different spirit from the spirit we received, or a different gospel from the one you accepted, you put up with it easily enough. Now, it's a nice little backhand to get things started. Paul says, I hope you're going to put up with me in some foolishness, because that's all this is. This whole thing, let's be clear, is completely foolish. The fact that you're even asking me to do this is completely foolish. But if that's what it takes, then I can play the fool. That's fine. But that seems to be okay because you put up with anything. You put up with every false gospel that gets thrown in your face, because apparently you guys are pretty foolish as well. So I guess the summary of all of this is that, well, it takes one to know one. So, all right. If you're going to be fools about all of this, then I guess that's what it's going to be required of me, is be a fool, because that seems to be the language that you guys also speak. So, all right, if that's the case, put up with everything that's about to happen, because It's just one fool talking to another. Verse 5, I do not think that I'm in the least inferior to these super apostles. I may indeed be untrained as a speaker, but I do have knowledge. We've made this perfectly clear to you in every way. So he says, look, I get it, all right? I admit I'm not a great speaker. All right, I'm certainly not as good as the super apostles, and I'm not as good as the sort of orators you guys are used to in Corinth. But I do know stuff, right? I do have knowledge, and we prove that. And remember, two characteristics, two things that are produced as a result of your education. One is that you can speak well, and two, you know things. There's no point being able to speak if you don't know anything. So you've got to be able to know everything. Hence, you're a philosopher. You know stuff. You're a lover of wisdom. And so then you can talk about it, but you can talk about it so well that everybody wants to listen. Paul says, look, on the one hand, my speaking wasn't that great for the reasons that I told you about, but on the other hand, well, hey, I do know stuff, okay? I do have knowledge, and that was very obvious to you guys all along. So I'm not completely inferior, all right? And this is the thing to keep in mind too. Paul was Saul the persecutor. Paul was the most advanced student of his day. He was trained by the best rabbi there was on the planet. Paul knew stuff. He was a very, very educated person, and that was obvious. And so they've clearly forgotten that. But Paul, they don't forget where I've come from here. Okay, I don't want to make you feel dumb with my superior knowledge, but don't forget the fact that I've got it as well. Verse 7, was it a sin for me to lower myself in order to elevate you by preaching the gospel of God free of charge? I robbed other churches by receiving support from them so as to serve you. And when I was with you and needed something, I was not a burden to anyone, for the brothers who came from Macedonia supplied what I needed. I've kept myself from being a burden to any of you in any way, and will continue to do so. As surely as the truth of Christ is in me, nobody in the regions of Achaia will stop this boasting of mine. Why? Because I don't love you? God knows that I do. So here again is the crux of the issue. He didn't take their money. This is what it all comes down to. He didn't do what is expected of a great speaker. And he will finish this whole passage coming back to this very point that he didn't take their money. He says, I robbed other churches so that I could preach to you free of charge. I did that as a favor to you. This was me helping you. You're welcome is what I should be saying here, rather than having to defend myself for not taking your money. And then the assumption is, what, I don't love you? You think I hate you? You think that I'm disgusted by your offer of support? What are we even talking about here? Of course I love you. That's why I didn't want to be a burden to you. I didn't want to put you through that. And yet somehow you've completely misconstrued it to think that it's because I hate you. I mean, what are we even talking about here? This is just so absolutely bananas that we've been having this conversation. It's absolutely ridiculous. But again, here we are. And so, look, that's why I did it. I did it to be a blessing. And apparently you think that I've done it because I don't like you. Crazy. Just absolutely craziness. Verse 12, and I will keep on doing what I'm doing in order to cut the ground from under those who want an opportunity to be considered equal with us in the things they boast about. He's talking about the super apostles here. For such people are false apostles, deceitful workers masquerading as apostles of Christ. And no wonder, for Satan himself masquerades as an angel of light. It is not surprising then if his servants also masquerade as servants of righteousness. Their end will be what their actions deserve. This is fantastic. The thing to keep in mind when this letter has been read out, and this letter has been read out to the church, right? There's somebody, it would have been Titus, standing up in front of the church giving Paul's defense. He would be reading this out right now. The super apostles are in the room. Everybody's gathered together to hear Paul's defense. They're in the room too. And so the fact that Paul doesn't even address them directly, that is the height of insult, right? That's a great rhetorical technique. Talk about the person that's in the room insultingly, but don't ever mention that they pretend they're not there, even though obviously they are there. It's the height of rudeness. It's the height of just rhetorical dismissal. This is exactly what Paul's doing. Those guys are in the room. And he says, why did I do it? To cut the ground from under those guys. I don't want to be seen to be working and playing by the same rules as those guys. I want to be different to them because they need to be exposed. If I acted like them, if I measured myself against those guys, then how would we be any different? But those guys are false apostles. Not even just that, they're not super apostles. They're not even apostles. They're false apostles, actual servants of Satan, masquerading as angels of light. And so, well, I don't even want to be in the same room as those guys, let alone in any sort of comparison with them. But again, They're in the room. This is just what's so fantastic about this response that Paul gives. These guys are there, and this has just been laid out in front of them. It's just fantastic. Verse 37, I repeat, let no one take me for a fool, but if you do, then tolerate me just as you would a fool, so that I may do a little boasting. In this self-confident boasting, I am not talking as the Lord would, but as a fool. So let's just be really clear about this. This is altogether stupid. Don't think of me as being an actual fool. I'm pretending to be a fool here. I'm playing the role of a fool because apparently that's what you need in order to understand my language. So, takes one to know one, but please don't think that I'm an actual fool. This is all just pretending, okay? But I will play the fool for now if that's what's required. And any boasting that I'm about to do, please, please, please understand it to be completely foolish. So just in case you weren't clear, Paul, this is a full speech. This is what it is, and this is why it's called the full speech, because this is just the total antithesis to what anybody would expect of boasting in the ancient world. Verse 18, he says, since many are boasting in the way the world does, I too will boast. You gladly put up with fools since you are so wise. In fact, you even put up with anyone who enslaves you or exploits you or takes advantage of you or puts on airs and slaps you in the face. To my shame, I admit, we were too weak for that. So again, let's be really, really clear. This is what a fool would do. But if you guys are so wise that you would tolerate fools, well, I guess that's just how I have to approach you. So, okay, that's fine. Because you're going to put up with anything, really. You put up with anyone that would abuse you. And what's so great about this language? The language that he's using here, it describes what was called in the ancient world a parasite. So think about that patron system I described before, where you become a client to a wealthy patron. Basically, they become your benefactor, and in return, you just have to sing their praises. You follow them around all day, and you can now because you don't have to work. You've got a lot of time on your hands because you've got this person that you're receiving benefits from. You're a perfectly healthy person that could go out and work. Rather, you've chosen not to work. Instead, you've gone and become the client to this patron. That's a parasite. That's a perfectly healthy being just sucking the life out of another host and doing nothing in return, just poisoning it in return. What Paul's describing here is a parasite, and he's saying if you guys can put up with parasites, then surely you can put up with foolish old me just having a little boast here. Again, a nice little sort of backhand at these guys who are actually in the room. It's just beautiful what Paul's doing. He goes on, whatever anyone else dares to boast about, I'm speaking as a fool. Let's be really clear. I'm speaking as a fool. I also dare to boast about. Are they Hebrews? So am I. Are they Israelites? So am I. Are they Abraham's descendants? So am I. Are they servants of Christ? I'm out of my mind to talk like this. I am more. So these guys are boasting about their Jewish credentials, right? They're Abraham's descendants. They're Jewish through and through, got the circumcision to prove it. Paul's like, I'm the same, right? I am thoroughly Jewish as you can imagine. So I've got all of those credentials working for me. But here's the important question. Are they Christians? And this is literally what he's saying. He says, are they actually Christians? I'm more. Literally, he's saying, I'm a better Christian than they are. Now, just stop and think for a moment. In what capacity could you ever say to somebody, I'm a better Christian than you? Imagine you go to church and you're hanging out with other Christians at church and you say, look, you guys call yourselves Christians. I'm a better Christian than all of you. I mean, you would just be the biggest jerk to say anything close to that. I mean, what a terrible thing to say. What an arrogant person you'd be. So how could Paul say this? How could he literally say, I'm a better Christian than these guys? Well, he's just described them as servants of Satan. Literally, these guys are servants of Satan. So, in other words, they're not Christians, right? You can either be a servant of Jesus or a servant of Satan. These guys are servants of Satan, so therefore they're not servants of Jesus, so therefore they're not Christians. So it's a pretty straightforward thing to say that I, as a Christian, am a better Christian than the person who's not a Christian at all. So it's not even really saying anything other than stating the obvious. Are they Christians? Yeah, I'm a better one because I'm actually one as opposed to those guys who are actually servants of Satan. So not really even a boast at all, and really certainly not Paul being arrogant, just pointing out the obvious. But here's where we get to the good stuff. This is what they've been waiting for. This is Paul boasting about the things that actually make him a better Christian. Now, they wouldn't have noticed. They would have heard Paul as being arrogant just then, saying, I'm a better Christian. That's exactly what they want to hear. That's the world they live in. They want people to say, I'm better than everybody else. But here's why. It's fine to say you're better than everybody else as long as you can back it up. Okay, that sort of boast is fine, but you've got to give us the proof. And if the proof matches the boast, fantastic. We'll believe that that's what you are. So he's made the claim, I'm a better Christian. Where's your proof? Now, this is where they're expecting Paul to be boasting and about all the great achievements and all the miracles and all the sermons and salvations and all of that. Paul says, all right, okay, we've come to this point. Let me tell you why I'm a better Christian. He says, I've worked much harder, been in prison more frequently, been flogged more severely, and been exposed to death again and again. 5 times I received from the Jews the 40 lashes minus 1. 3 times I was beaten with rods. Once I was pelted with stones. 3 times I was shipwrecked. I spent a night and a day in the open sea. Now, there are 2 punishments in particular that he draws attention to here. The first one is this is the 5 times I received from the Jews the 40 lashes minus 1. Now, what is that in reference to? This is a synagogue punishment. So go back to your Old Testaments where it talked about cutting somebody off from the people, literally cutting them off from the land. In other words, it's the sort of the Jewish equivalent of the death penalty for the more severe violations of Torah. So just a pretty standard sort of way to deal with people in the ancient world is the death penalty. That was the Jewish version. Now, when you come into the Roman time where Torah is still the scripture, you can't execute people anymore because that's the Romans' job, right? You don't have that authority as you would have back in Moses' day. And so that has to be changed to the environment, to the new context. And so the death penalty has been replaced with the synagogue punishment, which is excommunication. So if you're an apostate, like Paul was in the synagogue, somebody preaching Jesus as the Messiah, that makes him an apostate. That's going to result in what we used to punish you with, which is karet. It's this death sentence, but we can't actually execute you. So instead, what we're going to do is we're going to give you a choice. Choice number 1, we can excommunicate you from the synagogue. Choice number 2, we can flog you. And we're going to flog you 40 times minus 1. Now, why 40 times minus 1? Because it says in Deuteronomy, flog a person, but no more than 40 times. Otherwise, you're going to bring shame on yourself and the person. And so what the Jews would say is, okay, we will flog you no more than 40 times. And so the maximum we'll give you is 39, just to make sure we don't violate the 40. But it wasn't a fixed punishment. If you're a small person, like small in stature, they'd look at you and say, you probably can't handle the 39. That seems excessive, so maybe we'll flog you 10 times. Whereas for Paul, who's obviously a big guy, he gets this punishment the full 39. Now he says on 5 different occasions I got this punishment. In other words, on 5 different occasions, he's preaching Jesus in the synagogue, as he does, and they've said to him, enough's enough, you're gone. Now, you've got the choice. You can be excommunicated or you can be flogged. And on 5 different occasions, Paul says, I took the flogging. Why? Because if I get excommunicated, I can't come back here next Saturday or whenever my back heals and preach Jesus again. And so he takes the punishment on 5 different occasions that occurred. But then he says, 3 times I was beaten with rods. Now that's the Roman punishment. So the Romans don't have any qualms about how many times they hit you. They just beat you till their arms sore. And we read about one of these in Acts 16, where Paul's in Philippi and he's beaten with rods by the magistrate. Now that punishment is for insurrection, right? That punishment is effectively for treason. Preaching Jesus is treason, right? You're preaching a different Caesar. We've already got a Caesar. He's God. And you're preaching a different Caesar and God. That's a problem. And so on 3 different occasions, he gets beaten with the rods. Now, that, again, I've never been whipped. I've been flicked with a tea towel. That was painful enough. I've never been whipped. And so I certainly don't have any scars from being whipped. But I can only imagine the 5 times from the Jews, that we're talking about 200 lashes at least there, 3 times getting beaten with rods by the Romans. That's going to do a lot of damage to your back, right? There, Paul's back would have just been one great big piece of scar tissue. And I can only imagine what that does to your posture. I can only imagine how hard it must be on a cold morning just to stretch that skin out. And yet for Paul, that's his life. His back is just literally scar tissue. I mean, by the last of those beatings, it would have been just reopening more scar tissue. That's just the floggings that he talks about. He says, another time I was pelted with stones. He was literally stoned to death. We read about this in Acts 14 when they stone him to death, and then the believers come and pray for him and he comes back. I mean, an angry mob throwing stones at you are trying to kill you. And so it says in the scripture that they left him for dead. He was dead. You don't pelt rocks at people's head and in fury and you walk away from that. Paul somehow did, probably brought back to life. At the very least, he was knocked unconscious to the worst extreme. But again, I mean, what damage does that do? Like, what scars does that leave on your head? You know, Paul's walking around, he's literally had rocks pelted at his head. That's going to do some damage. If not, maybe some brain damage. I mean, there's got to be some serious repercussions from having an angry mob throw stones at your head until they think you're dead. That's got to do some damage. And then there's the shipwrecks. 3 times I was shipwrecked. I mean, how many times do you have to be shipwrecked before you go, you know, Jesus, enough's enough? Like, seriously, 3 times? Really? The first time wasn't enough. The second wasn't enough. 3 times we're going through this? Are you kidding? Like, come on, come up with something original, please. But then he goes on, verse 26, I've been constantly on the move. I've been in danger from rivers, in danger from bandits, in danger from my fellow Jews, in danger from Gentiles, in danger in the city, in danger in the country, in danger at sea, and in danger from false believers. I've labored and toiled. There's his working, right? His tent making, he hated it. And I've often gone without sleep. I've known hunger and thirst, and often gone without food. I have been cold and naked. He says, I can't even begin to list the specifics. Right? I mean, it's not even just that there was 1 or 2 things. It's every day. My life is a living misery. It's just running from one place to the next, being chased out of towns, being threatened to be killed on a regular basis. I mean, if I'm not being threatened to killed, then I'm looking around, am I dead yet? Like, what's going on? You know, getting stoned or getting flogged, that's just a Tuesday for me. Like, my life has been in constant misery because of this gospel. But yet, for Paul, that's the thing that aligns him with Christ. Christ on the cross goes through the worst possible excruciating form of death. And so to be an exemplar of that would mean that your life should look something similar. Well, here we are, Exhibit A. To be an apostle of Christ crucified, my life should look like it's also been crucified as well. Well, again, guess what? That's every day for me. So, yeah, I'm an apostle because my life does look exactly like the life of Jesus Christ. Verse 28, he says, besides everything else, I face daily the pressure of my concern for all the churches. Who is weak and I don't feel weak? Who is led into sin and I don't inwardly burn? He says, you know, the thing that's even harder than all of this is you guys, you churches. You guys make my life hell. I hear all these problems and I can't do anything about it. This is a time before Zoom calls and before texts and before letters or anything. You got to, if something's going wrong on the other side of the ocean, you can't do anything about it. And so Paul's got churches being persecuted all left, right, and center. And there's nothing he can do about it. I mean, the stress that would cause, the sleepless nights that would cause, just the stress of what's been going on in Corinth, all the months that have gone by, there's nothing he can do about it. I mean, talk about sleepless nights. And then he says, who is weak and I don't feel weak? I mean, you don't think I'm tempted? You don't think that the enemy's coming after me on a regular basis, trying to tempt me away from the faith? You don't think that I'm tested and pressured all the time, you know, into sin and into any sort of immorality or whatever that might look like? I mean, you think that the enemy's not coming after me personally? Like, of course he is. On top of all of the suffering, there's that as well. I mean, my life is just a daily grind of torture and suffering and persecution. But that's what aligns me with Christ. And that's what this is all about. He says, verse 30, if I must boast, I will boast of the things that show my weakness. The God and Father of the Lord Jesus Christ, who is praised forever, knows that I'm not lying. In Damascus, the governor under King Aretas had the city of the Damascenes guarded in order to arrest me. But I was lowered in a basket from a window in the wall and slipped through his hands. So this Damascus that he's talking about is modern-day Petra. And so this particular king, King Aretas, if you've been to Petra or seen pictures of the treasury at Petra, that's the funeral or that's the tomb of this particular King Aretas. So if you've seen that, that's what you're actually looking at here. Paul says, when I was there, the king was coming after me, wanted me dead, and so they lowered me down out of a window in the middle of the night in a basket, and I ran away. I literally ran away. Now, in the Roman military, one of the highest honor you can receive, the sort of highest military honor you can receive is the corona muralis, so literally the wall crown. That is when you scale a wall, get over to the other side and kill the enemy on the other side. That's the hardest thing any army can do, because to climb over a wall is difficult enough when you've got arrows being shot at you and how difficult that would be. But if you successfully do that, Of course, it's the highest honor because, that's the greatest thing you can achieve. Paul says, you guys are looking for some conquering military general, which a lot of these orators were. They'd done military service. Guys like Julius Caesar, one of the greatest orators of his time, also one of the greatest military campaigners of his time. He did both of those things. That's what you're looking for in your great men. Paul says, you're looking for a great general. No. When it all hit the fan, I was the first guy down the wall. Right? I wasn't the one charging over the walls to attack the enemy. No, I ran away when it all happened. That's about how good my military or my general ability is. So he goes on chapter 12, he says, if I must go on boasting, although there's nothing to be gained, I'll go into visions and revelations from the Lord. I know a man in Christ who 14 years ago was caught up to the third heaven. Whether it was in the body or out of the body, I don't know. God knows. And I know that this man, whether in the body or apart from the body, I do not know, but God knows, was caught up to paradise and heard inexpressible things that no one is permitted to tell. I will boast about a man like that, but I'll not boast about myself except about my weaknesses. So now we get into the good stuff. This is what the Corinthians are coming out for. They want to hear Paul talking about all of the great spiritual experiences that he has. He says, all right, cool, I'll boast about the spiritual experiences. Let me tell you about a friend of mine. Now, this is not talking about somebody else. He's actually talking about himself. This is an inoffensive way to boast. So everyone knows he's talking about himself, but it's kind of packaged in this pseudo humility of somebody else had this experience, but we all know I'm talking about myself. Now, it sounds a bit strange. It's not something we would necessarily do anymore, but it was just a rhetorical technique that these guys used. So I'll talk about this time I went to the third heaven, but I heard these inexpressible things. So it's like I literally met with Jesus, but I can't tell you about it. It's kind of like I could tell you, but then I got to kill you. So I'm not going to talk about it, only to know that it kind of did happen, that I kind of had this incredible experience, but I'm not going to boast about it. In fact, I'm going to stop talking about it because I've probably told you too much anyway. And the Corinthians are like, hang on, that's what we wanted to hear. Like, that's what makes you so good. Yeah, sorry, I just can't talk about it. So let's move on, Paul says. He says, even if I should choose to boast, I would not be a fool, because I would be speaking the truth, but I refrain, so that no one will think more of me than is warranted by what I do or say, or because of these surpassingly great revelations. Therefore, in order to keep me from becoming conceited, I was given a thorn in my flesh, a messenger of Satan to torment me. 3 times I pleaded with the Lord to take it away from me, but he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. He says, look, I could boast about stuff for weeks. I could tell you story after story that would blow your mind, but I'm not, because you know me. You know what I'm about. I spent 18 months with you. I've been working with you guys for a long time now. If that's not enough, then nothing ever will be. And the fact that you're even asking me this is what's most ridiculous about this. You know who I am. You know what I've done. You're here because of my ministry. You would not be here if it wasn't for my ministry. And so if I'm not an apostle, as you're saying that I am, then what does that make your faith? How can you be saved under my ministry if I'm not even an apostle in the first place? So the question's back on you here. So I'm not going to boast about all these wonderful things that I could boast about, because again, what's the point? If everything you've seen in me wasn't enough, then nothing else is going to be enough. It's not even worth having this conversation. So I'll leave you to decide, based on everything you know about me, whether or not I'm actually an apostle of Jesus Christ. He says instead that God gave him this thorn in his flesh. We just don't know what this thorn is. It's not even worth speculating. It's just, we don't know. It's as simple as that. And Paul says 3 times I said, God, take this thing away from me. And God says, no, I'm not going to do it. He says, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Paul says, you want to know what makes me an apostle? You know what is in abundance in my life? The thing, if you want my CV, if you want me to list out everything that I've achieved, everything I've done in Christ that makes me this great super apostle that you're looking for, here it is. It's the abundance of my weakness and the abundance of his grace. Everything else is rubbish. That's all I've got, is an abundance of my own human weakness and human failings and human brokenness, and the abundance of his grace that uses me nevertheless. That's what makes me an apostle. That's all I've got. That's everything I've got to offer. And that's it. Take it or leave it. But if you look closely, you'll recognize that that is actually what aligns me with Christ on the cross. And, well, that's what this is all about from the beginning. This is therefore I'll boast all the more gladly about my weaknesses, so that Christ's power may rest on me. That is why, for Christ's sake, I delight in weaknesses, in insults, in hardships, in persecutions, in difficulties. For when I am weak, then I am strong. So again, these Corinthians, they're looking for the super apostle. They're looking for the guy who is articulate, educated, well-dressed, sophisticated, all of these things that we expect from our worldly orators. Paul says, all I've got for you is just a laundry list of weaknesses and brokenness and failures. That's all I have. That's the best that I can offer you. But when that's me, when that is who I am, then in that place, Christ rests the most heavily. That's when Christ is the most powerful, when I'm at my most weak. And so again, if you understand what you should be looking for in an apostle, you'll recognize that you have that in me in abundance. The problem is not me. The problem's not my weakness and all of these things that you think make me inferior. Actually, these are the things that make me superior. The problem's not with me. The problem is with you, because you're looking for something incorrect in your apostles. You want something that actually doesn't characterize an apostle in any way, shape, and form. The problem is with you. You're the one with the mistaken assumptions or the mistaken framework. And, well, apparently I don't line up with that, but that's not my problem. That's your problem. And so he finishes verse 11, I've made a fool of myself, but you drove me to it. I ought to have been commended by you, for I'm not in the least inferior to these super apostles, even though I'm nothing. Just a nice little last backhand before we finish this all up, right? So I'm nothing, and I'm not in the least inferior to these super apostles. So if I'm nothing and they're less than me, they're less than nothing. It's just a nice little last quick jab before we finish up here. He says, I persevered and demonstrated amongst you the marks of a true apostle, including signs, wonders, and miracles. I did everything you wanted. I did everything that an apostle should in terms of demonstrations of the Spirit's power. You had that in abundance. The problem was, he says in verse 13, he says, how are you inferior to the other churches, except that I was never a burden to you? Forgive me this wrong. He says, I represented Christ perfectly. I represented a Christ on the cross. That's what my ministry was characterized by. Look, you wanted to see Christ, then you have to just look at my life. You see through me Christ on the cross. That's exactly what I was. But at the same time, I did the miracles, I did the supernatural powers, all those things that characterize the power of the Spirit in an apostle's life. You had that in abundance. You saw that time and time and time again. That was not something you in any way short on. But here's what the core of the issue is that I didn't take your money. I didn't take your money. And for that reason, you rejected me. I'm so sorry that I offended you by not taking your money. It was only because I loved you, but nevertheless, clearly I've offended you. Please forgive me this wrong. But that's all I've got. That's all I am. And I'm not going to change anything about how I behave and do that, because it's not about me. It's about you. It's about serving you, not the other way around. And that's what characterizes me as an apostle. So the question then is, are we Corinth? Well, that's up to you to decide. But I just wonder, when you look at your pastors, when you look at those in leadership, what do you measure them by? What are the characteristics that you think they should embody, that you think is what a pastor should look like? Are they real? Is that actually what a pastor should look like? Or is actually that just us taking a worldly set of categories, a set of categories that the world would define as success, and apply that to our pastors and say, you should look the same. If you are a successful pastor, you should have all of these other things as well, whatever those things might be. And so is your problem with, or even rejection of, your minister based on them not actually being a genuine representative of Jesus Christ, or them not fulfilling a set of categories or a set of standards that are actually a false set of standards? Is the problem with them, or is the problem with you? And so I guess that's a question, again, only you can answer, if that is even a question. But I would venture to suggest that there have been times, and there will be plenty more times, when we would reject a minister, again, based on these false categories. And so in that way, well, frankly, we're just the Corinthians. We're just doing what those guys were doing 2,000 years ago. And what we find in Paul's response is actually what the benchmark should look like, what actually is the response to what is ultimately a false assumption. So I'll leave that with you to think about. something to consider over the week. And so we'll come back next week. We'll do one more episode in this series of Are We Corinth? And we're going to look at taking other Christians to court. Is that something we should even be doing? What does Paul say about that? What's going on in Corinth when we do have these Corinthians taking other Corinthians to court? What does that mean for us today? So join me for that next week, but otherwise have a great week, and I will see you then.